Working this morning from the 18th chapter of the book of Genesis, and then a few verses at the end from the 21st chapter. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre when he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where's your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I'm worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word in print and Holy Scripture. We thank you for your word in flesh in Jesus Christ. Lord, speak to us now from your written word of your living word. For it's in his name that we do pray it. Amen and amen. The days had passed into weeks. The weeks had passed into months. The months had passed into years. And for Abraham and Sarah, God's promise had not yet been fulfilled. Abraham and Sarah had a special pain. The pain of the pain of barren years. The pain of a womb that had never been fertile. The pain of a home that had never known the joy that comes with a child's laughter. Sarah was embarrassed and disgraced to be married and not have a child. And Abraham was distressed. He was distressed because only a male child could inherit his father's property. And he was distressed too, because only a son could establish him as the progenitor of a great nation. Abraham and Sarah had tried everything they knew, even to include the liabilities and limitations of involving a surrogate mother. But the truth could still not be denied. The days had passed into weeks. The weeks had passed into months, and the months had passed into years. And for Abraham and Sarah, God's promise had not yet been fulfilled. I speak of the promise that God gave to Abraham and Sarah as if you knew what the promises were. Let's remember them together. Abram and Sarai were getting along great. They were living well. But then one day, God interrupted their tranquility, saying to Abraham when he was 75 years old, he said, leave your country and your people and your father's household and go to the land I'll show you. I'll make you into a great nation and I'll bless you. I'll make your name great and you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. He was 75. And then some 5 years or so later, God renewed his promise to Abram, saying, I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. And then when Abram was 85, God again renewed his promise, saying to him, don't be afraid. I'm your shield, your very great reward. A son coming from your body will be your heir. Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. And then 14 years later, God confirms his sacred covenant promise with Abram again, saying to him for the fourth time, you'll be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I'll make you very fruitful. I'll make nations of you, and kings will come from you. Abraham is now 99 years old. Sarah is 90. But at the end of the day, the truth still cannot be denied. The days had passed into weeks. The weeks had passed into months. The months had passed into years. And for Abraham and Sarah, God's promise had still not been fulfilled. And now 3 men are approaching their tent. Abraham quickly discerns that these are not typical visitors. Something strange is going on. Now let me pause here to remind you of an often quoted verse from the book of Hebrews. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing some people have entertained angels without knowing it. That verse brings to mind a bit of homespun wisdom from my mother. She used to say it's nice to be important, but it's more important to be nice. My friends, you never know when the divine is on your doorstep. You never know when heaven is on your street. After Abraham has a meal prepared for them, the 3 men begin talking about his future. But the truth is, Abraham does not have a future without Sarah. Now, though Sarah's been excluded from the conversation, she's standing just inside the tent. She's eavesdropping on everything that's being said. And the text tells us that in the middle of the conversation, Sarah laughed. Why? Why'd Sarah laugh? Well, I suspect that from her point of view, 3 men talking to Abraham about her giving birth at the age of 90 was a laughable conversation. See, they could talk about her having a child all they wanted to, but she wasn't having any part of that. Sarah knew that her days of being able to conceive a child, much less to nurse a child, she knew that those days were long gone. And Sarah knew too that she was not prepared to go through morning sickness. She was not prepared to go through the emotional and physical changes that inevitably take part in a woman's body during pregnancy. And Sarah knew too that that, shall we say, Abraham was not the man he used to be. That's why, when the suggestion was made by the three men that she would have a child at the age of 90, she laughed. She laughed. I see a lot of gray hair in here. What if a man came to you, a stranger, and told you you're going to have a child next year? I expect some of y'all would laugh too, wouldn't you? My mother would be horrified. She's 97. When she was 90, I reminded her of this story, and it was not pleasant what she had to say. But that's another story. But the thing is, Sarah's laugh evoked a response. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Now, folks, that's an important question. Because you see, if something is too hard for God, then perhaps God is not God. If something's too hard for God, then perhaps his sovereignty and his power is limited. If something is too hard for God, then we are doomed to live in a universe that's unstable. We're doomed to live in a world in which faith is useless. If something is too hard for God, then perhaps God is not God. Is God God? Let's look at that question for a moment or two on a personal level. Is there something that you're up against right now that you cannot handle? Is there something that you're up against right now that you're not even sure if God can handle it? Maybe a hard decision, a hard job. Maybe a marriage that's hard to stay in, or a husband who's hard to love, or a wife who's hard to live with, or maybe it's a child who's driving you crazy. When you pray, it's like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. You don't seem to get any kind of answer. You struggle and you struggle, but your struggles don't ever pay off. You keep on reaching out to help other people, but nobody comes to help you. You cry, but there's no one to wipe away your tears. And so you ask yourself, is what I'm facing too hard for God to handle? There's somebody here today who sat in the doctor's office this week waiting on the test results, knowing full well how bad the news was going to be before they ever heard it. There's somebody here this morning who's undergoing radiation and chemotherapy. Somebody here this morning is reeling and doing all they can to hold back tears because their spouse just walked out on them last week. Somebody here this morning doesn't know where they'll get the money for their next mortgage payment. Somebody here this morning is pregnant and doesn't want to be. Somebody here is standing by while a loved one wastes away from Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or dementia, and there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. Somebody here is growing old alone, and they're struggling to make ends meet. Somebody here is asking the question, is what I'm facing too hard for God to handle? Well, if you're that somebody, or you think you might be, in that boat one of these days? Well, then I got some good news for you. And the good news is this: when the Bible asks a question, it always answers the question. And the question is anything too hard for the Lord? That's there in the 18th chapter of Genesis. But friends, I believe the answer to that question is found in every chapter of every book in the Bible. Just a few quick examples. Remember Moses? Moses was standing there by the Red Sea with Pharaoh's horses and chariots coming up from behind him and death by drowning in front of him. And when God parted the waters and the people of Israel walked through to the other side on dry land, and when Moses turned around, you know what he saw? He saw Pharaoh's army coming after him, and he saw that water coming right in, drowning them. And I believe when Moses got to the other side, he looked back and he yelled out to those drowning Egyptians, I believe he yelled out, "Nothing is too hard for God." And how about Job? Job reached a point in his life when he thought that God had turned his back on him. He lost everything that he thought made his life worth living. He lost 7 sons and 3 daughters. He lost 700 sheep and 300 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys. And all of his servants and employees, all of them had been murdered. His wife called him a fool, told him to curse God and die. But Job's story does not end with his curses. It ends with his blessings. And when God restores back to Job twice as much as he had lost, I believe that Job fell on his knees. And he cried out to family and friends, nothing is too hard for God. And how about Jesus? Jesus said, there did come a day when it looked like God had run up against more than God could handle. There did come that day. They took him from the Garden of Gethsemane to the courtyard at the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. And it looked like that was too hard for God. The soldiers beat him all night long. And it looked like that was too hard for God. They made him carry an old rugged cross up a hill called Calvary, and there at the top they nailed him to it at a place called the Skull. And it looked like that was too hard for God. They hung him high and they stretched him wide, and his blood came streaming down. And it looked like that was too hard for God. Death claimed its victory, and it looked like that was too hard for God. They buried him in Joseph's brand new tomb, and they kept him there all Friday night and all day Saturday and all Saturday night, and it looked like that was too hard for God. All the while his disciples were hiding in an upper room. They were afraid because they thought all of it was too hard for God. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb to embalm his body. As the sun was peeking over the horizon on Sunday, she went there because she thought it was too hard for God. But early on Easter Sunday morning, Jesus got up and he walked out of that tomb to proclaim to the world and to you and to me that nothing is too hard for God. Nothing is too hard for God. Abraham and Sarah had a problem. They thought it was too hard for God. But you know what? Abraham and Sarah's problem was a problem you and I often have. See? Abraham and Sarah just couldn't wait for God to fulfill his promise. See, Abraham and Sarah were impatient, just like you and I are. Abraham and Sarah wanted what they wanted when they wanted it. Hear me, friends, when God makes a promise, you don't have to worry whether or not he's going to keep that promise. You don't need to worry about that. All you have to do is wait for it. Wait for it. David said, wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. Notice what he says. He says, wait for the Lord. He says, be strong. You know why he said that? Because waiting is hard. Waiting will wear you out. Have you ever waited in a hospital waiting room for hours on end? It'll exhaust you. David says, be strong. Wait on the Lord. Isaiah said, they who wait upon the Lord will what? Will renew their strength. Those who wait upon the Lord, you're going to get tired. But when it's God's time is right, he's going to renew your strength and something's going to happen. You're going to soar like eagles. Eagles are the highest flying birds. What he's saying is when God fulfills your promise, you're going to feel like an eagle soaring up there. And you know why you're going to feel that way? Because when you're up high, you can see much, much farther. And when God fulfills his promise, you can see the perspective that God has on your life. You can see what he was doing. You can see what it's all about. Your questions are answered. And you can see that during that time that you were waiting and stamping your foot, during that time, God was doing a work in your life to prepare you to receive you for what he was about to give to you. You know, we want what we want when we want it. But I sincerely believe that most of the time, if we got what we wanted when we wanted it, we couldn't handle it. See? Let that soak in just a minute. See? Now, my point is, friends, we cannot put God on a stopwatch. God's going to do what God's going to do when God is ready to do it and not before. Our role is to wait on the Lord, as hard as that might be. You see, it's God's time. It's not our time. Sarah laughed at the very thought of having a baby. But the text tells us in the 21st chapter, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said. And the Lord did for Sarah what? What he had promised. Sarah became pregnant. She's 90 years old. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. He's 99. And when did it happen? At the very time God had promised. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. Now, as you remember, a year earlier, Sarah had laughed at the prospect of having a child in her old age. I suspect, too, that Sarah was laughing because she got to thinking about, picturing in her own mind Abraham rocking a baby on his knees when he's 100 years old. That'd be an image to catch, wouldn't it? And she's thinking about all that, and she laughs about it. See? But now, Abraham, Father Abraham, is doing just that. He's bouncing baby Isaac on his knees. Isaac. The name translated from Hebrew means God is laughing now. Sarah laughed first, but now God is laughing. And in case you forgot, he who laughs last laughs best. Here's the thing, folks. God laughs. Why? Because God is God. And nothing is too hard for God. When God makes a way for you when there's no way, God gets the last laugh. When God opens a closed door for you, God gets the last laugh. When God heals your body and the doctors can't explain how it happened, God gets the last laugh. When God restores a broken marriage, or he brings a prodigal child back home, God gets the last laugh. When you realize that you are more than a conqueror, that nothing can separate you from the love of God, and that God's strength is made perfect in your weakness, when you realize those things, God gets the last laugh. Hear me, friends? Nothing is too hard for God, because God is God. When you were down, he picked you up. When you were lost, he found you. When you were alone, he stood by your side. When you were hungry, he fed you. Hear it again. Nothing is too hard for God, because God is God. One last thought. God can do everything but one thing. God cannot fail. And if God said it, you can believe it, see? Because God always keeps his word. He always keeps his word. The prophet tells us the grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God stands forever. Forever. In closing, I want to ask y'all to lighten up a little bit. You know, when we come to church, we kind of have our prim and proper ways, our church behavior. You know. And some of y'all sit there with your church behavior on, so I want to get you to do something a little unusual. I want you to think right now, what is the biggest problem you're up against right now? I don't want you to tell anybody. I just want you to think. What is it? See, it'll quickly come to you. What is that one problem that you know you can't handle and you're not even sure God can handle? I want you to think about it. Now, here's where the challenge comes. I want you to turn to the person on your right and whisper, nothing is too hard for God. Don't tell them what your problem is, see. They got their own stuff. Just whisper to them, nothing is too hard for God. All right, let's do it. Man, some of y'all don't know your right from your left in here. We're looking to the right. We're looking to the right. Nothing, you're whispering, nothing is too hard. Let's try it. Nothing is too hard for God. All right, here goes second part of the challenge. Turn to the person on your left and say, nothing is too hard for God. Nothing is too hard for God. Some of you fellows are going to a person that doesn't sit next to you, and I'm noticing that you're going to a prettier person. I tell you what, we got a ways to go in here. Oh my goodness, the harvest is plentiful. All right, now let's look up here and let's say it together. Nothing is too hard for God. Why? Because God is God, and God always keeps his promises. Does that give you a sense of hope? Think about what you thought about as that one problem that's there that you can't handle and you're not sure God can. What a difference it would make in your lives if you really believe that nothing is too hard for God. It might be too hard for you, but it's not too hard for God, because God is God. And God always keeps his promises. Walking around beforehand. I love going around talking to y'all before the service starts. And one of the folks here told me he's back. He's been in the hospital for 21 days. Hospital over in Hilton Head, then to Emory down in Atlanta, then back to Hilton Head, then over to another one, and back and forth to Atlanta in an ambulance. He told me that an ambulance ride from Hilton Head to Atlanta cost $5,000. $5,000. Now, I bet you during the 21 days he is wondering, see, could God handle this? Because the doctors weren't sure they could handle it. They shuttled him around back and forth to place to place to place. But see, nothing's too hard for God. He's here this morning. Got screws in him and all kind of stuff, but he's here this morning, see, to testify that nothing is too hard for God. We've got folks here this morning that are nursing parents that are on death's doorstep. You know, that's a hard ministry, friends. Hard ministry. Particularly if the person you're nursing doesn't know the Lord. Praise God. And a man after the first service came to me. Said, the Lord brought us here. I thought about our journey when you were talking about Abraham. And the Lord brought us here 4.5 years ago from up north to nurse our son who had cancer. He said he's cancer-free now. Has been for a couple of years. But here's the thing. We thought that God was bringing us here to nurse our son. But what God really brought us here for was to work with older people in nursing homes. And he said, now I'm part of the Friendly Faces ministry, and every week I minister to at least 40 people in nursing homes in this area. And I get to see the joy that was there. That's why God brought us here. See? Now, all y'all came from somewhere. Nobody's from Bluffton. Everybody came here, you know. But why did you come? See? And my point is, you think you know why you came. But I bet in the great scheme of things, God brought you here to prepare you for something you hadn't ever thought about. And you needed a season of waiting. You needed a season of preparing. You needed a season of ripening. So when God stepped in, you'd be right there ready to roll, and you would bless others in his name and for his glory. Why are you here? What is God preparing you for? That's the question. See? Because God is God and he's sovereign over your life. You're not here by accident. He's sovereign over your life. What's he preparing you for? You may not think you're waiting because you're busy as you can be, but you're in a pattern. God's preparing you. What's he preparing you for? A lady came to see me a month or so ago. She was coming. We talked on the phone ahead of time. She was coming, and she was coming about that very question. What does God want me to do with my life? And she was late coming. She was late getting to my office for the appointment. And she apologized. She said, since I was diagnosed as being legally blind, I'm having to drive slower these days. And I thought to myself, am I glad I'm in this office while she's on the road, see? But my point is this, see? Physically, she's going downhill, but she's come to see me about what is God wanting her to do with her life? See, that's the point. See, what is God wanting me to do with my life? She wasn't signing off because she was losing her sight. She knew there was more. And it wasn't about her, see. Help me figure out what does God want me to do with my life, however long that life might be. What's God want to do with your life? What are you being prepared for in this time of waiting? You've taken that first step like Abraham. You've left where you were and you've come here. Now, what's God got in mind for you? Say your prayers about that. Let's pray. And Father, thank you for the great trust you have in us, for the fact that you are sovereign, and we know that our faith is not wasted. You're sovereign over everything. There's nothing you can't handle. Tons of stuff we can handle. We just need to trust. We need to quit patting our foot, wanting you to act like a puppet on a string and respond in our time frame. We need to slow down and engage in your process of growing, your process of preparing, so that we would be ready when the time comes, when the waiting's over with and you're caused to soar like eagles and you see the big picture and you say, wow, this is where we're supposed to be. This is what I'm supposed to be. This is what he's preparing me for. Bless the waiting, Lord. Bless the waiting. Give us patience so that we might be for you who you create us to be, so that we might do for you what you create us to do. Oh, in your holy and precious name we pray, Lord. Amen and amen.